Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Christa Carmen.
And this is
Murder Coaster.
Ladies and gentlemen, step right up, step right up. What a show we have today. Behold, one of the darkest and creepiest big daddies of them all. The boogeyman that has long haunted the American subconscious. The butcher of Plainfield, the Wisconsin Ghoul, Ed Gein. And today's episode is a request from listener Allison Petite. Thank you so much, Allison. We hope you enjoy the show.
Let's begin. Prologue. The House of Horrors and Ed Gein's car. The rumor was that the old farmhouse in Plainfield, Wisconsin, where all the carnage and ghoulish acts had occurred, had been burned to the ground because there were plans of opening a tourist attraction there called the House of Horrors.
The fire department claimed they'd gotten lost trying to find the house, and that's why they hadn't been able to put out the blaze. Of course, the fire department was run by victim Bernice Worden's son, Frank Worden.
The whole story had actually broke when sheriffs searching for missing widow Bernice Worden found her in Ed Gein's summer kitchen, hanging upside down by a wooden stick run through her ankles, naked, decapitated, gutted, and strung up like a deer.
They found her head in a burlap sack with bent nails through the ears so as to hang it. Her heart was on the stovetop. Some say it was in a bag. Others say it was cooking in a pan. And they never did find her liver.
Inside the House of Horrors was also a box of noses. As the judge would later say, quote, Ed Gein had a great love for noses.
One wall was a plaque of sorts, made from a pair of human breasts, stuffed so that the deputy said they looked real as hell.
There was a belt made of nipples.
Skull caps used as bowls that Eddie liked to eat beans from.
They found a chair, lampshade, wastebasket, and drum made of human skin.
A window shade pool decorated with a pair of women's lips.
And a knife with a human bone handle and sheath of human skin.
There were skulls on his bedposts and 4 face masks hanging on his bedroom wall, 5 more face masks and bags scattered about, and a shoebox with 9 vaginas in it. Some dried with salt, one daubed with silver paint and trimmed with a red ribbon, one so fresh it was clearly newly cut from the body.
They also found what appeared to be a skin suit, pant legs made of human skin, and an apron fashioned out of a woman's chest.
They couldn't understand where all these body parts had come from, and assumed he must have been a mass murderer. But later, they would find that nearly all of it had come from women he dug up, older women who reminded him of his mother.
Only 2 women had been murdered to become part of Ed Gein's sick fetish collection, Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan. At least, that was the official ruling, though rumors ran wild, and there's a lot of speculation that there were other victims as well.
Ed Gein's maroon 1949 Ford sedan, which he had used to transport the bodies of the 2 women he murdered, as well as those he exhumed from graves in nearby cemeteries, was auctioned off.
15 bidders vied for the car, but the winning bid of $760 went to a carnival sideshow operator from Rockford, Illinois, named Bunny Gibbons.
Gibbons put mannequins in the car to represent Gein and Warden and exhibited it at county fairs around the state that summer as Ed Gein's Ghoul car.
For just 25 cents, anyone could get a look at the car that, quote, hauled the dead from their graves.
It made its first appearance at the Outagamie County Fair in Seymour, Wisconsin in July 1958. And over the course of 3 days, some 2,000 visitors parted with their quarters for a glimpse inside.
The exhibit caused so much controversy that the group Mental Health America of Wisconsin petitioned to end it. And at the Washington County Fair in Slinger, Wisconsin, the sheriff shut the exhibit down.
And then the Ghoul car was banned from being exhibited in the state of Wisconsin, and Bunny Gibbons went back to Illinois.
Bunny faded into obscurity, and to this day, no one knows what happened to Ed Gein's car. Just one of the many mysteries which encircle the case of Ed Gein, like circling vultures.
And though Ed Gein, the butcher of Plainfield, has been the inspiration for countless movies, books, poems, video games, spawning characters as diverse as Leatherface, an obese mute butcher wearing a skin mask in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Norman Bates, a thin, smooth-talking nerd in Psycho, to Buffalo Bill, a goth transgender psychopath with a pet poodle in Silence of the Lambs. There are so many questions that linger.
Was he schizophrenic? Was he a serial killer? A cannibal? A necrophile?
And now that Netflix has recently released their version of events with Monster, the Ed Gein story, the public has even more questions. Was he a misunderstood Romeo in a complicated decades-long love affair? Was he known for wearing a bra? Did he love prog rock and the band Yes? Did he work with the FBI to help capture Ted Bundy and write the mass killer Richard Speck?
Spoiler alert, the answer is going to be no to all of those.
Who was Ed Gein? Well, we have scoured sources from far and wide, from historians to true crime authors to the judge in Eddie's trial himself, to give you what we think is the most definitive look that we can. Now, let's get into it.
Chapter 1. Little Ditty About George and Augusta.
Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin, the second son to George and Augusta Gein.
And to understand Eddie Gein, it is imperative to understand his parents, George and Augusta.
Interestingly, Gein was not the last name of Ed's father, George. It was Guy, but he didn't like how George Guy sounded, so he changed it to Gein later in life, a name which would become infamous in the worlds of horror and true crime.
Gein definitely has a more sinister ring to it than Guy.
You think so?
Guy sounds like a name for a grandparent that a little kid would make up. So yeah.
Oh my God, it does, doesn't it?
Totally.
When George was just 3 years old in 1879, living on a farm in Bergen, Wisconsin, his mother, father, and older sister left in the family horse and carriage and never returned. being tragically swept into the Mississippi River in a flash flood.
Now an orphan at just 3 years old, George was adopted by his uncle Leonhardt, his mother's brother, who was said to be stern, overbearing, and having little love in his heart for children.
You will also see it said that George was raised by his grandparents, but we're going with the version we get from the Plainfield historian Scott Bowser, whose word I tend to trust more. He may not be as skilled a writer as Harold Schechter, but as a local researcher, I think he may have the upper hand. Either way, it is said to be a cold, hard upbringing.
After graduating elementary school, George apprenticed as a blacksmith for a while. Then, in his early 20s, headed off for the big city of La Crosse.
La Crosse at the turn of the century was nearing the end of a lumber boom and becoming a major center of beer brewing, with its large German population, creating breweries like Gund and Hillman.
German was, in fact, the second most spoken language, and you could hear German spoken in the streets.
With both the Mississippi and the Black River flowing through the city, it was a major transportation hub and was also connected to 2 markets and major cities through the railroad and 2 major highways. And while the lumber boom was coming to an end because of the depletion of the white pine forests, rubber and textile factories were booming. So La Crosse, Wisconsin was pretty happening back then.
Disturbingly, La Crosse was also what's called a sundown town, where there'd be trouble if anyone who wasn't white was caught in the city after dark. Yes, they were all very racist.
George Gein worked for a while selling insurance, then turned to carpentry, and being a good German, developed quite the taste for beer, hanging out in the German beer halls, the Kneeps, and Wirtshauses.
George drifted from one job to the next, working in a tannery, at the city power plant, and on the railroad. And through it all, he drank, becoming a moody and foul-tempered drunk, filled with a brooding self-pity, drinking away all his pain.
Then, when he was 24, he met 19-year-old Augusta Wilhelm Lerck.
Augusta had been born in La Crosse on July 21st, 1878, and was from a very strict and religious German family.
Her father, Friedrich, a German immigrant, was one of the old Lutherans from Prussia, who left Germany under religious pressure to give up old Lutheranism and join the Protestant Church of the Prussian Union.
The old Lutherans, a minority, were much stricter than average Lutherans, in particular when it came to confession, and whether the wine and bread in the Lord's Supper became the actual blood and flesh of Jesus.
Augusta's father constantly railed against the modern ways of America, its loose morals, as opposed to the morally rigid old world of Germany.
This old school theology also very much believed that to spare the rod was to spoil the child. Augusta's father believed life was endless toil and hard work, unwavering thrift, and extreme self-denial, and he beat this belief into each of his 8 children, Augusta in particular taking his old world religious principles to heart, especially the belief that all humans were infected with sin and most were doomed to the fires of hell.
But she did play the accordion, an interesting fact you don't hear too often. And she would eventually even pass this love of music down to her son, Eddie.
Augusta grew into a large and intimidating woman, the most dour and stern of her sisters, having a fierce, no-nonsense scowl on her face. And she did not receive a lot of suitors.
In essence, she was basically no fun. And it was looking like she might be headed for spinsterhood when she met George Gein, who is now calling himself George Gein.
It's thought that she could have been introduced to George through her cousin Fred, who worked with George at a leather tannery, a job that would later fascinate his youngest son, Eddie.
To Augusta's eye, George was something other than what he truly was. George had become a beaten man, silent and doleful, brooding and darkly melancholy. But she had mistaken this stern decorum for him having a reserved and dignified manner, as many actually did. Later, his neighbors would say they thought he was a retired minister because of his brooding and stern bearing.
Augusta saw George as a good Lutheran, though not of the old order from Prussia. She saw him as the silent and strong type, a hard worker of German descent, stalwart in his quiet lack of words, and she had no idea that he was actually quite lazy and absent-minded, and his only real pleasure in life was drinking himself unconscious.
And George most likely saw Augusta as a means of stability. She was from a big family with relatives all over the city. He was an orphan with nothing, no one. Despite her resting bitch face, stern demeanor, and large stature, he hoped to find a comforting home, perhaps even a mother figure.
And so it was that George and Augusta were wed on December 4th, 1899, at the Chaseburg Vernon County Lutheran Church.
But from the beginning, all was not marital bliss.
Immediately, Augusta realized that her new husband's quiet ways weren't a dignified manner, but symptoms of drunkenness and sloth, and she wasn't afraid to loudly tell him so, openly sneering at him and calling him a lazy dog.
Stung by her insults, George simply stopped talking to her. He just completely ignored her, gave her the silent treatment. He'd go off to work, refusing to speak to his wife, then head to the bar, get wasted, stumble home, and if Augusta came at him, started shouting in his face, calling him a drunk and talking about Jesus, he'd just smack her hard with his callous leather tanning hands, and she'd fall crying to the ground, shouting that he was no good, while he silently stumbled off to bed.
Though Augusta saw sex as horrible and loathsome, she was determined to have children, and tolerated the awful deed for procreation reasons, though it revolted her.
Well, she sounds fun.
So on January 17th, 1902, their first child, Henry, was born.
Now with a child, Augusta set out to find her drunken husband a respectful job. Two of Augusta's brothers ran mercantile stores, selling, quote, fancy groceries. So they helped George set up a meat and grocery shop on 914 Caledonia Street called Gein Mercantile.
But George was becoming more and more of a helpless drunk, too intoxicated to carry out his duties, and Augusta soon took over all aspects of the business, waiting on customers, handling the cash register, keeping the books.
Yeah, really revealingly, in the city directory, in 1909, George Gein was listed as the owner of the store. But 2 years later, in 1911, it's Augusta who is listed as the proprietor, and George is simply listed as a clerk.
Burn.
And Augusta was pregnant again, which brought her solace and hope.
It said she yearned to have a daughter, a little girl to raise properly, to have a refined nature, unlike these rough, coarse boys and men. She couldn't seem to connect with Henry, and had grown to despise George. She longed for a girl.
But it was not to be so. For on August 27th, 1906, she gave birth to a son that they named Edward Theodore Gein.
Chapter 2. Little Eddie.
Supposedly, from the moment Augusta heard she'd given birth to a son and not a daughter, she felt bitter and betrayed.
Eddie was little, a bit on the frail side, and had a growth on his left eyelid, a little lump of flesh that caused the lid to droop, as well as a lesion on his tongue, which would cause a minor speech impediment.
Ed Gein would later say he had two distinct memories of being a little boy in La Crosse, Wisconsin. One was him stumbling at the top of a flight of stairs, feeling like he'd been kicked, then looking down at the vertiginous steps, sure he was going to be badly injured. And just as he was beginning to fall, his mother grabbing him by the arm and saving him from certain doom. Yet he wasn't sure if she'd kicked him or saved him, or both. But from that moment on, he says he put all of his trust and faith in Mother. Mother was his everything.
His other clear memory was a windowless wooden building behind the meat and grocery store that he was forbidden to go in. He'd seen animals led into the building, then heard their horrible screams as they were slaughtered.
So one day, while his parents were busy, little Eddie, always a curious child, snuck out the back door of the grocery store and went to the small, strange building and peered in through a crack in the door to see a large pig hanging upside down from a chain on the ceiling, his father holding it steady as his mother ran a knife down its belly and began pulling out ropes of viscera, gathering the glistening guts into a large metal tub.
His mother turned, her long leather butcher's apron coated in fresh blood, and silently locked eyes with him. It was an image he would remember for the rest of his life, that would never leave him. His large, imposing mother, covered in blood, a knife in her hand, glaring at him.
Augusta began to see La Crosse, Wisconsin as a city of vice and sin, a modern-day Babylon, full of harlots and sinners. The women on these streets would smile. Absolutely shameless. Women should never smile. It's unladylike, carnal.
I myself have not smiled since 1992.
That's just because you're like casual goth.
She toiled in the store, saving every penny, determined to make enough money to buy their own property, to become landowners and people of means, to leave the sinful city and live a pastoral life, a biblical life, a life off the land, away from this Sodom and Gomorrah of a city. It was no place to raise two boys. A place where women smiled.
The audacity. And so, when Ed was 7 years old, in 1913, the family moved 40 miles east to a small dairy farm in the lowlands near Camp Douglas. But that would be just a halfway point, as they only stayed a year before moving 80 miles further away from La Crosse to the tiny farming village of Plainfield.
Chapter 3. The Village of Plainfield.
In 1913, Augusta used her hard-earned savings to buy a 195-acre farm at N5691 2nd Avenue outside Plainfield, Wisconsin, 109 miles east of her birthplace in La Crosse.
Very interesting to note, this is a time when women often weren't allowed to own their own property, run their own businesses, but records show this land was purchased by, and the deed of the farm written out to, Augusta Gein.
The village of Plainfield had been settled in 1849, only 60 years earlier, when one Elijah Waterman built a 6-by-12-foot shanty and started renting rooms in it. Soon, the flat, sandy land was dotted with farms and ranches. There was a post office and a mercantile store, and a town was born.
The sleepy little farming village earned a murderous reputation just 5 years after Elijah established it, when a fellow named Cartwright killed a local named Furman in an out-of-control bar fight.
When Cartwright was released on bail, claiming the murder had been done in self-defense, the town yokels swore they were going to lynch him and raided his farm where he lived with his wife and children. They got into a gunfight, during which Cartwright killed 2 of them. Then they started to set his house on fire with his family in it. But they finally got Cartwright to surrender under the pretense that there was a judge present and he'd be taken to court and tried.
But they didn't take him to court. They took him directly to a hay barn where they hanged him. Then they tied a rope around his ankles, dragged him back to his house, and threw his battered, lifeless body inside to his horrified wife and daughter.
It was barren, bitter, unforgiving land. It was and remained a population of struggling farmers working rocky soil, trying to grow rye or potatoes and raise a little livestock.
But the people were hardy and persistent with old-fashioned values, the whole town turning out every year for the annual Christmas celebration.
In 1913, when the Geins moved there, the town of Plainfield was just a single paved road, and locals would say, "At least you don't have to worry about kids hanging out on the street corners. We ain't got no street corners."
The Geins bought what was called, at the time, the John Greenfield Place, but would forever become infamous as the Gein Farm.
It was a sprawling rye and dairy farm, seemingly easy to run, as rye didn't take particular care to grow, and then milk would be the literal fat of the land. But it would prove much harder than they had ever thought.
The house was 2 stories and L-shaped, with a parlor, a kitchen, 2 bedrooms on the ground floor, and 5 more rooms upstairs. There was an attached summer kitchen, a windowless, dirt floor shack used for butchering animals that stayed relatively cool in the summer. There were a number of outbuildings, including a large barn for the dairy cows, equipped with a milking station, a chicken coop, and an equipment barn, as well as an outhouse. There was no running water or modern conveniences.
The farm was 6 miles from the village of Plainfield itself, where the general store was, which may not seem much today, but back then with dirt roads and wagon travel, it was a significant distance. The Geins would go to town about once a month for supplies.
But even the hard-working and pious people of Plainfield proved to be too scandalously below Augusta's standards. And, scandal of scandals, the town was full of Catholics, and there were no Lutheran churches. There was even a Baptist church, but no Lutheran church, not even for those sinful modern Lutherans.
So Augusta would stride through town with her nose in the air, not wanting to deal with the Catholics and Baptists. She'd be curt with the merchants, rude to the others, and soon the family was more or less shunned by the town.
But Augusta couldn't care less.
Augusta set her best furniture out for display in her parlor. A cherry wood bureau, a stout wooden rocking chair with elaborately carved arms, a pine bookcase stacked with leather-bound books, a large oriental carpet, family portraits in heavy gilded frames, and a painting of Jesus gazing upwards at an angel above him.
Augusta was particularly proud of her neatness and cleanliness.
Little Eddie went to Rocha Cree Grade School, a tiny one-room building with around a dozen students. Like his mother, he liked to play the accordion, an image you never see in movies or documentaries. And he also played the violin.
There was even a violin in his house of horrors when he was arrested 44 years later, though it didn't have any strings.
I've often wondered about that violin, if he had any ghoulish plans for it. Like that song, The Dreadful Wind and Rain, when the drowned girl's breastbone is used to make a fiddle, her hair used to make a bow, and her finger bones pegs.
I love that. Eddie was an average student who did well in school, but he loved to read. Reading would be a lifetime obsession.
Books would be Eddie Gein's only real friends for his entire life. While in school, if Eddie got friendly with a boy, Augusta would belittle him, call the kid trash, say he wasn't good enough for her Eddie.
With his lazy eye and minor speech impediment, Eddie often found himself a source of ridicule at school and was frequently bullied and laughed at. There was talk that he had an effeminate way about him, the way he held his hands, his mannerisms, and he'd cry very easily, especially when the other children would teasingly chant, "Eddie's got a saggy baggy eye, saggy baggy eye, Eddie's got a saggy baggy eye."
Eddie developed odd behavior, nothing dangerous and no real red flags, but he had a curious habit of smirking. This odd, lopsided grin and shifty eyes always moving, never settling in one spot, and a morbid sense of humor and a habit of laughing at inappropriate times, like when being told a neighbor had a heart attack or was shot and killed in a horrible hunting accident. Little Eddie would grin and begin to chuckle, his shifty eyes darting back and forth.
According to the Ed Gein story, when Ed was 12 years old, Augusta discovered him masturbating in the bathtub. She grabbed his genitals and called them, quote, "the curse of man."
Augusta preached to Ed and Henry daily about the evils of women, the corruption of the flesh, and the sinfulness that lay beyond their property, saying all women were evil besides herself, who was a saint, and that the boys must remain virgins.
She alternated between vicious criticism and possessive affection, creating a deep psychological dependency.
By the time Ed reached adulthood, his mother voice had become so internalized that it functioned as his primary psychological source of reason.
When it rained or snowed and they were stuck inside, Henry and Eddie would gather at Augusta's feet as she rocked in her rocking chair, a Bible on her lap, regaling them with the tale of Noah, saying another rain was going to come and wash away the sinners.
Then she would read them from Revelation.
So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication, and upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery Babylon, the great mother of harlots and abominations of the earth.
And from Proverbs as well.
The lips of a strange woman drop honey, and her mouth is smoother than oil, but her latter end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a 2-edged sword. Now, therefore, my sons, hearken unto me, and depart not from the words of my mouth. Remove them way far from here, and come not nigh the door of her house. For why shouldest thou be ravished with a strange woman, and embrace the bosom of a stranger? Why, O son of my womb, give not thy strength unto women.
Eddie would describe his mother as pure goodness, unlike other women, and Augusta kept her boys close to her on the farm. And in 1920, when Ed graduated 8th grade at 14 years old, he stopped going to school and remained on the farm full-time.
Chapter 4. George.
Come all ye tender Christians, wherever you may be, and likewise pay attention from these few lines from me. I was down at the depot to make my getaway, and Providence being against me, it proved to be too late. I tried to play.
Meanwhile, the family patriarch, Eddie's father George, slipped further and further into the bottle, drinking his days away.
He'd held some authority in the family by his strength alone, being the man of the house and the disciplinarian, delivering beatings and whippings. But now that Eddie and Henry were too big to be beaten, were young men and no longer children, George had lost that status. Now he was a washed-up drunk, though Eddie still loved to hear stories about leatherworking.
But the old lions roared just to hear themselves, and George would sometimes rant and scream while on a bender, making ridiculous, drunken, paranoid accusations, like that Augusta was a harlot and was cheating on him with other men, an absolute impossibility. Not only was she a cold, stern religious woman, but she never left the farm, so it was technically impossible.
The marriage was a nightmare, but divorce to a pious woman like Augusta was unthinkable.
And so life went on, endless labor and just scraping by.
The farm was a constant, grueling grind of hard work, waking before dawn to feed the cattle and begin the milking, tilling the earth and spreading manure fertilizer without the aid of a tractor, planting rye in the fall, coaxing it to grow all winter in the sandy, acidic soil.
They were unable to make any improvements whatsoever. No electricity, no indoor plumbing. While the twinkle of lights began to flicker in the distance as electrical poles went up in the rest of Plainfield, and modernity crept into nearby farms with septic tanks and flush toilets, pickup trucks and gasoline-powered tractors, the Geins remained in the 1800s.
Meanwhile, the house began to show wear, its once neat and perfect exterior flaking away, front steps splintered, the porch sagging, everything weather-worn and dilapidated.
Henry dated a few girls, made a small go of it, but Eddie never really even tried. He'd later say he'd taken a couple of girls to the movies, but never once kissed a girl, and was a lifelong virgin.
Their 20s slipped past them, and for Eddie and Henry, life was a daily struggle of farming, their mother alternately preaching and then condemning them, their father slipping deeper and deeper into the bottle until he became utterly useless, and then was an actual burden as his health faded.
In 1937, when Eddie would have been 31 years old, and they'd been on the farm for 23 years now, Father George, now 63, became an invalid, unable to walk or care for himself, and was completely dependent on a family that detested him.
For 3 years, the family fed George and bathed him and bought him liquor, maybe in the hopes of speeding his death up, who knows. And in 1940, when he was 66, he died from pneumonic fluid in his lungs, brought on by severe alcoholism.
The funeral was held at R.A. Golt's Combination Furniture Store and Funeral Home on April 4th, 1940, and his obituary read, George Gein dies. George Gein, 66, was born August 4th, 1873, and passed away April 1st, 1940. His mother and father and little sister precede him in death. They were gone to town, and he was staying at home because of the high water, as it was raising the Mississippi River. The father, mother, and sister never returned, leaving him an orphan boy. He lived in La Crosse until 1914, then going to Plainfield, where he resided. He had suffered considerably for the past 3 years, but his sufferings were eased by his faith in God. He was a good husband and father, and will be missed by all who knew him.
Chapter 5. Weird Menace.
For much of the world, everything changed on December 7th, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, pulling America into World War II. Though little changed for the Geins.
Henry was too old for the draft, but at 36, Ed was still eligible. So in 1942, he traveled to Milwaukee for his physical exam. Farthest he'd ever been, or would ever be, from his home.
But because of the growth on his left eyelid, which slightly impaired his vision, the Army rejected him, and Eddie returned home to his mother and brother on the dairy farm.
Henry and Eddie began taking on odd jobs as a means of bringing in money.
Eddie worked as a handyman, hanging windows, patching roofs, painting houses, repairing fences. He also babysat, and the kids loved him. He'd do goofy magic tricks and tell creepy stories about cannibals and headhunters from the books and magazines he read.
He'd have snowball fights with them and play their games. As a kid, he'd never felt comfortable with his peers. But now, as an adult, he related more easily to children as opposed to adults.
Folks found Eddie Gein to be a nice, quiet guy, very dependable, though Henry was considered the harder worker and tougher and more worldly of the brothers.
During the 1940s, Henry worked for a road-building contractor, setting poles and stringing wires for a power and utility company.
While they were close and enjoyed going fishing and hunting together, Henry was branching out, and he began hanging out in town after work and seeing a widowed woman. And Henry would sometimes tell Eddie that he needed to not be so close to their mother, that it was weird, that he needed to get out, that the world wasn't as sinful as their mother claimed, though Eddie refused to believe him and hated when Henry talked down about their mother in any way. To Eddie, she was perfection.
And while Henry was branching out, Eddie was retreating inward, becoming increasingly obsessed with pulp true crime and horror. It was a golden age in many ways, especially as the Comics Code hadn't come to pass, which would seriously censor comics starting in 1954. So true crime and horror could be as wild as they wanted to be.
True Detective Mysteries was founded in 1924 and had initially been a fiction magazine publishing mysteries. But by the 1930s, it was becoming increasingly focused on true crime. And in 1941, the name was changed to True Detective, emphasizing the magazine's move away from mystery fiction and into true stories, becoming a massive hit, selling around 2 million copies per month and inspiring countless imitators.
Then there was the weird menace subgenre of comic books and pulp magazines, which reached a peak of popularity in the early 40s and featured stories in which the hero was pitted against sadistic villains with graphic scenes of torture and brutality.
The first Weird Menace title was Dime Mystery Magazine, which in 1934 had the infamous cover of a naked blonde woman being held down on an altar, a bloody machete perched above her, held by a cloaked villain. The words, "The weirdest stories ever told," scrawled in the lower corner.
Precursors to horror comics include detective and crime comics that incorporated horror motifs into their graphics, and early superhero stories that sometimes included the likes of ghouls and vampires. Individual horror stories appeared as early as 1940.
Now, it has been strongly implied that Ed Gein read pulp, World War II comics and magazines, which exploited Nazi war crimes, in particular those of a sexual nature, and that he read a comic book entitled The Bitch of Buchenwald about the infamous Ilse Koch.
One of the most quoted and well-researched biographies of Ed Gein actually has him reading the men's magazine Man's Action, with a painting of a sexy Nazi Ilse Koch on the cover, wearing a Gestapo uniform and beating concentration camp prisoners with a riding crop. But Man's Action magazine didn't even come out until 1957.
And that is the kind of research you will find only here, ladies and gentlemen. The truth is, directly after World War II, folks were eager to put the horrors behind them, and there wasn't a lot of information about concentration camps. It slowly began leaking out in newspaper articles as the Nuremberg trials proceeded, and the atrocities came fully to light. And Ed Gein surely was probably reading about this in the newspaper during the Nuremberg trials, as the entire world was.
The pulp and sexploitation of Nazis didn't come until later, in the 1960s and 70s.
The first pulp paperbacks to exploit Nazi war crimes, particularly in an overtly sexual and even pornographic nature, were released in Israel and coincided with the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem.
These books, called Stalag fiction, depicted female Nazi officers sexually abusing male Allied prisoners and were incredibly popular, in particular among the children of concentration camp survivors, but were quickly banned by the Israeli government.
But with the cat out of the bag, Nazi sexploitation continued, culminating in the 70s with Ilse She-Wolf of the SS, a notorious film from Canada. And soon Italy was getting very into it with the excellent The Night Porter, followed by a whole run of sexploitation Nazi movies, SS Experiment Camp, SS Girls, Women's Camp 119, Last Orgy of the Third Reich, and Nazi Love Camp 27, among many others.
But all of this was long, long after the arrest of Ed Gein.
Ed Gein very well may have been inspired by the war crimes of Koch, who infamously had a lampshade made from the flesh of a prisoner. And Eddie may have even sought out articles and books about her. but he wasn't reading pulp magazines and comic books about her because they didn't exist yet.
And Ed Gein never once mentioned Ilse Koch publicly.
But Eddie definitely was reading the newspaper panel Ripley's Believe It or Not, which had started way back in 1918 and detailed bizarre facts, oddities, and strange tales from around the world, all so bizarre they are hard to believe. And I can't help it. I just fucking love Ripley's Believe It or Not. I used to go to the one in Ocean City, Maryland as a little kid. The one in San Francisco is actually particularly nice.
Besides having a comic panel in the newspapers, Ripley's Believe It or Not also put a popular pulp book out in 1929 and had a national radio syndication beginning in 1930, and by 1944 was on 5 nights a week.
And one thing that thrilled Eddie were the tales of South American headhunters, and Ripley's Believe It or Not was full of pictures of shrunken heads, another of Ed Gein's obsessions. And they even include a rather detailed instructions on how to make a shrunken head. A disturbing process of removing the skin from the skull, then sewing the eyes and mouth shut, drying it out with hot rocks, and boiling it down to shrink it.
Ed also read anatomy and medical books compulsively, becoming obsessed with the human body, in particular the female reproductive system.
Chapter 6. O. Henry.
On Tuesday, May 16, 1944, a horrible tragedy occurred when Henry Gein died while fighting a brush fire.
Henry was 43 at the time, and Ed was 38. They weren't like young spring chicken teenagers or 20-somethings. They were fast approaching, if not already in middle age.
Much has been made of this death, many speculating that Ed killed his brother.
Plainfield historian and author Scott Bowser claims Henry was planning to move off of the family farm to live with a divorced mother of 2. And the shame of that prospect drove Ed to kill his brother rather than the family suffer such an indignity, perhaps even at the behest of his own mother. And he says everyone in Plainfield knows that this is true.
In the end, whether or not you think Ed Gein killed his brother dictates how you view him as a whole, and how to judge his later crimes. If he murdered his brother, then he is a cold-blooded killer who knew what he was doing.
On the other hand, if he didn't kill his brother, his future actions could be seen as those of a deeply mentally ill man lost in a daze, not realizing what he was doing, literally innocent by insanity.
Even the very basics of what happened are disputed, including who started the fire and why.
I will say, as a reader of Erskine Caldwell, I know it was very common to burn fields back in the old days. They mistakenly thought that they were actually fertilizing and helping the land by burning off the brush. Ever read Erskine Caldwell, Tobacco Road?
I have not. No.
It's good. You like Southern Gothic, but like trashy and sexy, and like it's good stuff. It's over the top. It's like written in the 1920s. You dig it. So at the time, it was reported in the newspapers that it was Eddie's idea to start the fire, and that he'd insisted his brother help him. But later, Eddie would say it was all Henry's idea.
Whatever the case, evidently a strong breeze blew up, sending the fire towards a stand of pines on the edge of the field, and Eddie ran there to extinguish the fire line. And when he returned, he couldn't find his brother. It was getting dark, so he took off towards town and quickly rounded up a search party, including Deputy Sheriff Frank Engel.
But although Eddie claimed he didn't know where his brother was, he somehow led the search party right to him, and his brother was there lying face down, obviously very dead.
When they asked Eddie how he'd been able to lead them from there if he didn't know where his brother was, he just shrugged and said, "Funny how that works."
And although the ground was scorched about him, there were no burn marks on Henry, though there did seem to be bruises around his head.
But the coroner said there was no appearance of foul play, and ruled that the death was due to asphyxiation.
Now, I have no idea if Eddie Gein killed his brother, but personally, I deeply suspect that he did not do it.
Most victims of fires don't die from the burns, they die from the smoke inhalation. So if Henry was standing in the middle of this field fire and the wind blew and all that smoke hit him, it could have knocked him unconscious. He hits his head and gets a bruise, and the fire, just smoldering grass really, blew on past him, didn't even burn him, and the heavy smoke was enough to asphyxiate him and kill him.
If this had been a fight between two brothers, I suspect it would have been much more knocked down, drawn out. There'd be a lot more bloodshed, more than just like some small bruising. And Eddie was the smaller, younger brother and more effeminate, the literal mama's boy. I don't know. I mean, I guess he could have just snuck up behind him and hit him in the head with a shovel and hope that the smoke would asphyxiate him, I guess. It just seems doubtful to me.
Yeah, I'm kind of inclined to agree.
He's not his type. He likes old women.
In the third week of May, 1944, Henry Gein's wake was held in Galt's funeral parlor. It was now just Eddie and his mama.
Chapter 7. Augusta.
Augusta had always been the driving force of the family, the strong one, the worker, the earner. She was a big-boned, pinch-faced German workhorse who'd run their grocery in La Crosse and saved the money to buy the dairy farm in her own name, who'd supervised the labor, the plowing and seeding, the harvesting, and then physically help haul the rye from the silo to the cows at dawn herself.
I researched this so deeply, I was reading 1900 farming manuals on how to raise dairy through rye. But after Henry's death, Augusta changed. She grew weaker and fainter, sickly. One night, she asked Eddie to drive her to the hospital, and by the time he pulled up to the Wild Rose Hospital, she was unable to walk.
She'd suffered a stroke.
During her hospitalization, Eddie stayed at her bedside, devoted, until she was finally discharged. And then he carried her back home and laid her in her bed.
It was a strange moment. She was now completely dependent on him for everything. She who had been the powerful one. And now Eddie had a chance to prove himself to her, to prove his worth, prove his love. She couldn't walk and lay in bed, commanding what must be done, giving the chores, telling Eddie how the manure must be gathered and put in the spreader and sprinkled in the fallow fields, which then needed to be cultivated and seeded before the heavy frosts. In the evenings, he would sit by her bedside and read to her from the Psalms.
Do not forsake your mother's teachings. Bind them always on your heart. Fasten them around your neck. When you walk, they will guide you. When you sleep, they will watch you. When you awake, they will speak to you. For this command is a lamp, this teaching is a light, and correction and institution are the way to life, keeping you from your neighbor's wife, from the smooth talk of a wayward woman. Do not lust in your heart after her beauty, or let her captivate you with her eyes.
It's said Eddie would curl right up in bed with his invalid mother and stroke her hair, whisper in her ear.
By the middle of 1945, Augusta was recuperated enough to attempt to walk, and Eddie, who would be 39 years old, would stand to the side and aid his mother.
Augusta gathered her strength and steely German resolve, and for a brief moment was back to herself. But then after going to buy hay for their cows and seeing a neighbor beat a puppy to death while the woman he lived with, dressed only in a nightshirt, begged him to stop, she grew faint and had to be rushed home.
Yeah, this shit's really weird. I don't know. Supposedly it wasn't seeing a puppy being beat to death. I mean, that's pretty fucking gnarly right there. But it was seeing a scantily clad woman living out of wedlock with their neighbor farmer that shocked her back into ill health. Just seeing a scantily clad woman screaming at him going, "No, don't kill it, don't kill it." I don't know. It broke her. Eddie would talk about this later and he would get super emotional about it and like pretty much say that was the reason that his mother died.
And then, just 4 days after Christmas, she had a second stroke. Eddie rushed her to the hospital, and on December 29th, 1945, at 67, she passed.
While the deaths of both Henry and George had seen long obituaries, the death of Augusta, whose dour personality and grim attitude didn't earn her many friends, if any, well, her death didn't merit much in the newspaper at all. Just a few sentences saying,
Mrs. Augusta Gein died at the Wild Rose Hospital on December 29 of cerebral brain hemorrhage. The body was brought to the Galt Funeral Home, where services were held December 31. Reverend C.H. Wise officiating. She is survived by one son, Edward, who lives on the home farm southwest of here.
Eddie wept uncontrollably throughout the entire funeral, his face covered in tears and snot, managing to say through fits of ugly crying, "She was just too good for this world. She was perfection."
But despite all his tears, Eddie noticed something during the actual burial. His mother had a concrete vault that held her casket. When he asked the funeral director about it, he said, yes, Augusta requested a concrete vault, which cost more, but most folks just had a simple wooden vault.
Chapter 8, 1946.
Eddie was all alone on the farm now, the last of the Geins on this lonely, windswept land of pale, sandy soil and hard stone.
He sold off the last of the livestock to pay for the funeral.
Ed then sealed off Augusta's bedroom and sitting room upstairs, preserving them exactly as they had been on the day she died. He boarded up the rest of the house, too, only leaving the parlor, which he turned into a bedroom, the kitchen, which became his workroom, and the back summer kitchen, that windowless dirt floor room used for butchering and storage.
He stopped farming altogether, just let the manure spreader and tiller lay in the field and rust, let the pines and shrubs come invade the farmland. He leased a few good acres out to a neighbor to grow on, and received a government subsidy through a state soil conservation program for the rest, basically getting paid to let most of his farm go fallow.
He stopped shaving every day and bathing. Folks in town started noticing his lack of hygiene and odor.
But he was still polite and friendly, would help saw firewood, haul grain, repair a barn, and babysit. He worked as a handyman, cleared brush in the summer, plowed snow in the winter.
He never cursed, was always well-mannered and quiet, if a little dirty and rough around the edges.
He was like something out of a John Steinbeck novel, tied to the land but broken by it, alone.
He spent a lot of time at the Plainfield Cemetery on 5th Avenue, between routes 30 and 59, where his brother, his father, and his mother were buried. Strolling the grounds, noting how the strip of tall trees separated the graveyard from the surrounding farmland, giving its own closure, the strips of trees down the rocky drives that cut through the land.
Established in 1835 as a burial ground for residents, the first inscription noted in the cemetery logbook was made June 19, 1837.
Deep in mourning, Ed would find himself coming to the graveyard at night to visit his mother's grave, especially on the full moon when he didn't need any light to see. He'd lay there at her grave, weeping like a child all night long in the moonlight, hoping to resurrect her by sheer willpower, praying and praying that she'd come back to life, rise from the grave, be with him once more. He felt eternally lost and alone without her.
Spending so much time in the graveyard, Ed watched how the graves were cared for. When the cemetery closed, who was in charge? He learned the ins and outs of burials, studying the wooden vaults the caskets will be lowered in when they were buried.
And at some point, he got the notion that he could easily dig up a grave, break into the wooden vault, and take a body.
It's believed by most that Ed Gein did not dig up the body of his mother, Augusta, though few doubt that he thought about it. Most say that he didn't do it simply because the concrete tomb she was in made it impossible. Couldn't get through.
But German filmmaker Werner Herzog believes he had an elaborate set of tunnels and did dig up the body, and once came there with a shovel ready to prove it.
I believe the tomb is as dark and empty as this godless universe of chaos and violence. I love Werner Herzog. He made the 70s Nosferatu movie. Remember that one?
Oh, yeah.
Others say Ed didn't dig up his mother because she didn't give him permission to. That he would have needed her explicit consent to do such a thing. And it was simply his fear of her that stopped him from digging her corpse up.
What he needed was a proxy. Someone who was his mother but wasn't. A body he could have to keep him company. A shell he could crawl into, like a baby crawling back into its own mother's womb. A substitute. Eddie started spending time in other cemeteries as well, such as the Spiritland Cemetery, studying them, their entrances and exits, and he began reading the obituaries as well. One February 5th, 1947, Ed was reading the obituaries in the newspaper when he read,
Sister of local man dies. Rites planned Friday. Plainfield. Mrs. Miriam W. Beggs, 69, died suddenly at 4 o'clock Tuesday at her home in the town of Pine Grove, Portage County, following a heart attack. I love the name Spiritland Cemetery. Isn't it? It had such a surreal touch to this whole story too, man. It makes like a fairy tale. So creepy.
Yeah, very much so. Ed went to Spiritland Cemetery the day after her burial, and using a piece of metal rod began poking the soil, determining how soft it was, pushing it down until it hit the wooden vault, tapping with the rod until he determined the dimensions of the vault.
He returned that night with a shovel, a tarp, and a crowbar, and broke into the wooden vault, dropping down into the darkness where the sleek ornamental casket sat. Surprisingly, it was unlocked, swung right open, revealing the prize inside. The corpse of a 69-year-old woman with a passing resemblance to his mother.
Eddie hauled the body out, lay her there in the moonlight as he repaired the vault lid and shoveled the soil back in, careful and meticulous, leaving the grave, in his own words, quote, in apple pie order.
He took the corpse home, hung it by its ankles in the winter kitchen, where his father and mother had once slaughtered hogs, gutted it like a deer, dumping the viscera into a rusty old cauldron that is actually now on display at Baggins Haunted Museum in Las Vegas.
Gazing at the body hanging there upside down and spread eagle in the shadows, his eyes followed the trajectory of the pale legs, leading to that spot of forbidden femininity where they met.
This would have been the first vagina Ed Gein had ever seen, besides perhaps a passing glance at his mother's crotch as he bathed her and helped her dress.
He'd studied the vagina in medical textbooks, no doubt, but now he was faced with one literally in the flesh. This mysterious slit of flesh that was the pinnacle of female sexuality, where all the mysteries of the universe came from, where life itself issued forth.
Eddie Gein then took his knife, an old file he'd sharpened and put a handle on, and carefully began to cut into the flesh around the vulva, delicately carving out her vagina, then placing its stretched taunt in a cardboard box to mummify.
He then sawed off her head and hung it by its ears and began to skin it, slitting it open in the back and slowly peeling the skin free from the skull, just like the directions for making a shrunken head in Ripley's Believe It or Not.
But he wasn't making a shrunken head. Oh no. For a shrunken head had the eyes and mouth sewn shut so that evil spirits couldn't escape. This was going to have eye holes in it. This was a mask.
He was making a mask he could wear, flesh he could hide his own face behind, becoming a mask of his mother, and he'd make himself an entire suit out of flesh. And then when he wore his flesh suit, when he placed a dried and withered vagina into his underwear to hide his penis with and draped himself in the literal matriarchal skin, he could be free for one ecstatic moment. He could dance in the moonlight and be free of all pressure, relieved of the burden of existence and all its complexity. Only then would he be truly whole, truly satisfied, truly free and transcendent.
But to hear about that, and we're going to get into it with great detail, you'll have to come back next week for part 2 of the story of Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield.
See you next week.
And do you have a story you'd like us to cover? Let us know at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening. Bye.
And with each be sweethearts while they sit around and spoon. There's two lonesome people in the whole wide world. That's me and the man in the moon.